nice and warm evening, and feel free to join us here because the drinks are half price and the finger foods are free. Can't get it better like that anywhere else. And of course, there's great conversation. I've got two great guests with whom I'm having drinks tonight over the subject, the vexed subject this week of education. Should secondary education in Ghana be free and for everyone? Why? How much would it cost us? And how would we pay for it? Or is the question of the financial cost, is it beyond debate compared to the cost of ignorance? Dr. Nimoy Thompson is Director General of the National Development Planning Commission. He's here. And for him, there are no ifs or buts, no caveats. Patrick Stephenson, he heads the Center for Economic Governance and Political Affairs. His position is slightly more nuanced. Then, of course, there's you, would like to know what you have to say on the matter as well. Of course, you're the most important. And so join us on Facebook, and we're streaming live on Facebook. So go to our Facebook page, Star 1035 FM, and like it and drop us a message. You can also send us a tweet. Star 1035 FM is the handle, or you can send it to my personal handle, which is at Kwaku 101, or send us a WhatsApp 026-251-8268, 026-251-8268. And the lounge is brought to you by Johnny Walker. Keep walking. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us in the bar.
Thank you.
Patrick and Nee. Nee, is your Thompson with a P or without?
With a P.
With a P and with an H.
Yes, sure.
So it's a Thompson. Okay.
Actually, it's with an H, but it's still Tom.
Thompson. Okay, good. What are you drinking?
I'm actually just did damage to a glass of pineapple and orange, so I'm actually waiting for a refill.
Okay, would like something slightly bolder?
No, I'm a choir boy, so I don't do anything.
Right, okay. Patrick, how about you?
Well, I'm just doing water.
Just water.
Very safe.
Excellent. All right. So, yes. So, should I start with you, Nee? Free education. Did you get free education? Was your education free?
To a very large extent, yes. If by my education you mean my basic education.
Your basic, yes.
Yes.
All right. And we're talking primarily here about basic education, where basic education is defined as right now.
Yeah. Now it's up to JHS.
Up to.
Yeah. But government intends to incorporate SHS now,
right.
So we have the whole spectrum.
Pre-tertiary.
Yeah, pre-tertiary, if you want to put it that way, which is actually
okay.
Better. To a very large extent, yes. The issues of feeding, which as a child I thought was free, but I just recently spoke with my sister who told me that there was some nominal, it really didn't cover the cost, but it was some nominal fee that parents paid with the rationale that whether you go to school or not, they will feed you anyway. So
hopefully.
Yeah. But in terms of basic tuition, materials and whatnot, for my generation, yes, it was free. After the coup, after Nkrumah was overthrown, of course, they tried to change that, but that didn't work, and they went back to basic.
I mean, without, with the intention of telling everybody how old you are, we're talking about the 60s or something?
Yeah, 60s. Okay. That's
still looking good for somebody who went to school in the 60s.
Thank you. So that's pretty much it. But beyond that, beyond my own personal experience, when we think of education and whether or not it should be free, we're also thinking about its role in development. I wrote the term you put down, the cost of ignorance. And you use the word cost and not the price tag that we keep hearing about, 600 million. I don't even know where that number came from. But even if it was 800 million, the question is, so what? If it's an investment, which is what it is, then we should find every means possible to pay for it. It's like building a national rail network. That's fiscal capital. Now we are looking at human capital, which we need. currently, as we sit here, our human capital is very, very low. It cannot make us competitive in the 21st century. We just cannot do that. And so you need these kind of bold, aggressive, revolutionary approaches to fix the problem. And that's where we are. So the issue of paying for me shouldn't even come up. Is it relevant? Is it essential to our survival in the 21st century? If we say yes, then payment becomes secondary.
Patrick, is payment secondary or primary?
Well, like my position would be
The pun unintended but appropriate.
that's right. It's interesting. Payment by its very essence, in my view, has got to be very relevant.
It's got to be very relevant.
Very relevant.
Okay.
It has to be relevant because, I mean, I agree with Doctor when he says the cost of being ignorant or having an ignorant population or working class. You cannot quantify that because, I mean, that could have all sorts of social costs, other economic costs that can be associated. And so
Even political costs.
Absolutely. And so we're not typically looking at the monetary value, but at the end of the day, the education itself as a service has got to be paid for. And so for a government or for any society that has finite resources, and our resources are not, they are not infinite. I mean, if we take the size of the government budget, there are certain claims on it. And so if we recognize that education is something that is essential, then of course there are going to have to be, some trade-offs that we will have to make to commit ourselves to it. Are these trade-offs easy trade-offs to be made within the political economy that we have as we speak today? It becomes very difficult to, provide just the typical yes or no answers to them. I say that because we've had, for example, the F-cube model that has been deployed.
Free compulsory universal
basic education. And that, in my view, and from reports and stats that come from even Ghana Education Service, for instance, it doesn't appear we have completely been able to eradicate the challenges that you have at the basic education level, i.e. junior high school and senior high school, because there's still a lot of people who do not have access as we speak, which will call for further expansions, and so the cost equally becomes an issue that has got to be tinkered with. Besides that, you have issues concerning the quality of even the service that's been delivered, and I suspect that if you look around now, it is easy to find, parents who would typically prefer to take their children to the private basic educational institutions, fundamentally because of some of these things, that you are educating the kid, so the kid is able to, become somebody that is relevant to society to avoid the social cost and
to be relevant, society, and for their own good as well.
Absolutely.
Their families and their future generations.
Right. And so whichever way you look at it, whether it's the government that's going to find the money to fund it, or it's private people that are going to pay for it, there's a cost that's associated with it, and we cannot, take that out of the equation when we're having a conversation about how it is that we are going to provide the service.
Okay, so starting point, basic education. Do you agree that basic education should include senior high school?
Well, I mean, that's just a matter of, reorganization and organization of what the educational system itself really looks like. I don't suspect defining the secondary, adding the senior high school system to the junior high and then the primary really changes the dynamic in any significant way. Of course, we've seen, challenges for people who are transitioning from, say, the basic education level into the tertiary, into the senior high school, where, the exam ends up, filtering some of the people out of the system.
But do you believe that every child in Ghana should have education up to senior high school?
At least.
At minimum.
Absolutely, Kwaku. Absolutely. You cannot have an uneducated population. And so, in the ideal case, the ideal situation is that you would create opportunities for everybody, because, if you keep looking at even some of the numbers that come from, say, the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index, for instance, the ability of this economy to move from its very subsistent level to doing things in innovation and technology heavily depends on how we're educating, the children. And so it makes sense to suggest that everybody, and I don't dispute, I don't think anybody, I think if you even look across the political divide, the consensus you get from the country now is we need every child of school going to get education.
I asked me a question about whether his basic education was free or not.
Right.
Was yours free?
Well,
did you go to a public school?
Sure. I mean, I went
school.
through the public basic educational institution
And public
system up
secondary school.
Secondary
you didn't go
school
to
as well.
an international school.
No.
You didn't go to Eton or Harrow or
no, I pretty much enjoyed.
I pretty much non-Saito. That's
right. Okay, so you did Saito like
yes,
me.
I pretty much enjoyed the Saito system, as you call it, but it wasn't that bad. I mean, even if you look today at second cycle educational institutions or senior high schools, I'm tempted to believe that the best performing ones, you would find in the public sector. I mean, I could be wrong, but you're seeing the likes of at Disardel, you're seeing, Ogasco, you're seeing all of these other schools.
But that's the cream
de la creme.
Right? And then you've got the rest at the bottom.
Absolutely.
Anything you want to rebut?
That itself is problematic. There's a book. Anyway, after this program, you may want to look for it. It's a very good book. It's actually a series of lectures by the former Vice Chancellor of University of Ghana, Professor Ivan Adai-Mensah, called Education, a Tool for Social Mobilization, Social Mobility or Social Stratification. And he gives some very frightening statistics as to why we really need to fix this system, because the system, it seems, has actually been rigged against the poor. So it's actually reinforcing poverty and inequality. And it's not sustainable. At some point, it's going to implode. We're going to have the kind of social instability that we just don't want to have. So that's one angle to that. The second angle and the most compelling case for incorporating high school into basic education is that without high school, we really are not going anywhere. Your engineers, your architects, your medical doctors, your accountants, they all come from SHS stock, not JHS, which is BECE. Unfortunately for us, the bulk of the youth population, and not even the larger labor force, but the youth population, the bulk of them, almost 80% of them, are BEC or less. That's simply not up for any discussion. We just need to do something to remove that, to make sure that at the very least, and even that is a first step, because we're moving into an era in the global economy where even secondary education is no longer enough. In the UK, for instance, there are certain professions where now first degrees are not enough. So giving secondary education to every Ghanaian is not quite where it should be, but at least it's a start. And it's from that stock that we're going to get our professionals. Otherwise, currently it's only 15% of youth with secondary school education. You can't do much. And with 80%, and within the 80%, almost 15% of them have no education at all. So effectively, they're unemployable. Effectively. That's why government after government keeps saying, well, we'll create employment for the youth. Well, you can't do anything. It's not just work, but also decent work. You get paid well. With that level of education, you can do that. So for the long-term plan, for instance, that we're working on, this is one of the key recommendations. It just happens that the government's own policy coincides with that. Plus, it's also an evolution. If you read the history of Ghanaian education, it used to be standard one, those standards things.
Standard one through.
And even after basic
7.
education, you had to take an exam before you move on to upper primary. And so over time, we've incorporated
from upper primary to
standard
the
7,
school.
the middle school from 4 and so forth. And it's been evolving. And then they brought in this disastrous JHS system in 1987. 1987. JSS, it was called then, which really has destroyed the futures and dreams of millions and millions and millions of children. Hopefully, these reforms will help restore that. And this year, by the way, is also the 10th anniversary of the last education sector reforms. This was 2007 September. So this year, in fact, we are having a forum to kind of review what has taken place since then and what needs to be done. But with education, it's like the essence of development itself. I happened to have met with the president actually early in the year on January 6th when I visited him at his house. We discussed a number of things. And one of the things he told me was that without education, we're not going anywhere. Which was more or less an echo of what J.H. Mason used to say when he was senior minister and when he was secretary of the Planning Commission during Nkrumah's time. Education, education, education. And then lastly, let me give you an example, an international example of the role of basic education and access. The US, we all know, was once upon a time a colony of the UK. One of the most critical decisions they made in the US that actually turned the table and made them the superpower they are was to democratize basic education. While the British were still obsessed with Eton and the rest of it, the Americans said, no, every single American child must have basic education. So when you go to the US, the term PS, public school, is pretty much part of the vocabulary of every parent. Where do you go? And it is required. You don't have any option of saying, no, I'm not sending my child. Mm-hmm. If you decide to do homeschooling for your child, you must go for a curriculum. Mm-hmm. But you can, my niece was in town a couple of years ago with her kids from the States, not knowing that the second they were born, their names had been put into a computer. Mm-hmm. So in year 6, they were supposed to show up in school, and they hadn't shown up. And she was sent a notice, and right away she had to buy tickets and send the kids back home.
Well, I know someone who had a similar experience, who lived in Germany with his children, and they moved to Ghana.
Okay.
And I think the first week or so after school reopened, he hadn't notified the city authorities that they had left. Yes. And they went to their flat looking for the children.
It was regulatory enforcement.
Because it's against the law not to have children go to school.
Yes, yes.
So if basic education is compulsory or is to be compulsory, then how do you compel somebody to do something that they cannot afford?
Well, then that's where...
I mean, if the state won't play its part, how do you, and I don't have the means, then you cannot compel me to comply.
Well, sure.
When there's a cost, a financial cost to obeying the law.
Absolutely, Kwaku. Which is why the position again is very nuanced, because then we agree in principle that everybody, I mean, there's no debate there. Every child of school-going age has to be in the classroom. We agree on that.
Up to what level? Because we need to be clear.
Oh, up until the senior high school level. Even if we have to include that, we have to broaden it to include that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We agree. The problem then becomes how you finance it. Now you frame the question right. Can the state compel you when you don't have the means to pay for it? So essentially, the state has got a role to play, and we don't downplay that. But the argument that there are a lot of people who don't have the means, but have to get their children in the classroom, and you need the state to step in for them, and you have those who can pay, okay? And you have a state that typically is tax inefficient. I mean, you are not mobilizing sufficient revenue to support developmental, projects and things like that. It would make sense to, for example, suggest that the number that can afford, okay, and if you look at the way the structure of our, the way the kids transition up onto the senior high school level, you would recognize that at the BEC, typically it is the kids who would have done well that will transition into most of your public schools. I mean, if you take the top 100 now, and you decide to profile these students, I mean, naturally, it may be skewed towards the children who are coming from the BEC system, who have typically been through the private educational institutions. So that immediately creates a certain problem, because if I'm in the rural area where I have to write the same exam,
you're disadvantaged.
I'm typically disadvantaged, and I am the person who has to be protected somewhat. Should we introduce the condition of the limited resources that's available to the state to deliver that end? And so
for those who can afford it, is that what you
for
mean?
those who cannot afford
Who cannot
so
afford.
Initially you don't have that discrepancy. That discrepancy immediately shows up because you have limited resources, and so you need to find a way to protect those that are socially vulnerable. I find it strange that there's a kid who probably may have gone through, say, a typical grade A private school, made the grades, and then ends up in a public school, and there's one who scored grades that the computer selection system as we have it today, as effective as it may be, does not give an opportunity to another kid because they couldn't make the grades, they were simply disadvantaged. I find that strange, and we have to protect this kid just because it's a systemic design. It's just the way the system looks like.
Okay. I cited the example of Germany, where actually, unlike the UK and the United States, education through tertiary level is free for every citizen. In fact, not just citizens, but including foreign residents. So whether you're an American or whatever, it's free.
Right.
And they're able to pay for it. The question, Ni, is what the issue he raises. What about those who can afford it?
Who can afford what?
Who can afford to pay?
To pay what? In public schools?
Yes, in public schools.
No, again,
must the state pay for them? Shouldn't we separate or be able find a way of some means testing?
No.
To set aside those who can afford it?
No. It's this.
From
We are
those
talking
who
about
can.
basic education, not tertiary education. You don't want some elaborate bureaucracy that's going to find out whether a kindergarten kid comes from a home. First of all, we don't even have the database to find out which kid comes from a wealthy home or a poor home, whether the parents filed for tax returns. So that is completely out of the system. Now, we shouldn't talk about the state as some abstract entity out there. It's government with revenue collected from the citizenry and, of course, corporate entities. And we have, of course, and I must emphasize this, a progressive taxation system. So the more you earn, the more you pay, of course. So if I pay my taxes, someone else pay their taxes. Maybe on the progressive scale, I pay more, they pay less. And government decides that they're going to offer free, compulsory, basic education. I can choose to take advantage of the taxes that I paid already, or say, okay, use my taxes as public funds, but I'm going to take my child to a private school. That's my decision.
Which increasingly we're seeing.
We are seeing because there's been a neglect, and that's really an indictment of our generation. Right. Those of us who profited from public schools, and somehow we've abdicated our responsibility to sustain them. It's an indictment on us.
But is increasingly the case now that more and more people who can afford it, who are affluent, and sending their kids to public secondary schools.
There are a number of reasons for that. As we've kind of stigmatized.
I'm not questioning I'm not even into the reasons now. Just saying that it's a matter of fact. It's a trend.
It is, but there's a reason. We must understand the causes for that. One, it's been stigmatized as being somehow for lower quality. They have this thing they call Kokonte and whatever. Kokonte and Katia uniform, which it automatically stigmatizes you. We shouldn't have done that. Now there's kind of a bit. Well, when we went to school, I went to Methodist school, the yellow and blue. It was a source of pride. So we've done that. Spatial planning has contributed to that problem. We didn't plan spatially well. So we have communities just expanding. In other places, they actually have township limits. You can't go, so it spreads. You go to places like Brekusu, Kwabenya, and all that. They just spread without any planning for essential facilities. And the only including schools. So the only facilities there are these private schools. Now, there's a myth about private schools that we need to confront. It doesn't follow that because they are private schools, they are necessarily better. No. In fact, if you look at the statistics, they have a much lower percentage of trained teachers. The public sector has something like 80% plus. The target under the plan that we're working on is 100% trained teachers. For private schools, it's much lower. So I think it's about 36 or around 40%. So we have all these issues that are throwing up critical social factors in terms of having access, and not everyone can actually afford to take their kids to these schools. So yes, ultimately, we must fund it. The state is not just there's monies that we put in there. So if the state decides to do that and I don't want it, and trust me, if the state provides the right facility, sometimes even the aesthetics of the environment, does it have flowers, does it have green grass and all that, that alone can inspire some confidence in it. We've abandoned that. Now, in addition to that, the issue of can we or can we not, we have a history of that. In 1952, the first CPP government under Kwame Nkrumah had the accelerated education program. That's what actually made education free. And a lot of the people from that generation benefited from that. And then they had the Education Act of 1961, which then took it a step further and made it compulsory. That's when they started giving free books and so forth. Some of us inherited that much later on after he was overthrown, because I remember in primary school, in addition to the books, they'll give us a pen. You may remember they're called the Apex pen, the blue Apex pen versus the big. They'll give us chocolates and so forth and so on. But the challenges that Nkrumah faced back then, Kwame, how can you do that? How can you fund this and that? He said, no, just what? So he mobilized resources. You cannot let resource constraint. He kept talking about finite. It's not finite. You can create resources if you want. Already, I've heard arguments about tax inefficiency and so forth. We have one of the highest tax rates, tax revenue stroke GDP in the world, 17%. They're already thinking of moving into 20%. Our recommendation is that it should actually come down to around 15%, but you grow the economy. You make more than enough money to do that. In addition to that, you need cost efficiencies. I don't know if you've read the report, the government's white paper on the Sole Commissioner's report. Mm-hmm. Your head will spin. The scope and scale and depth of corruption in this country. And after reading, I said to myself, but we are actually capable of funding our own development without asking for a pesewa from anywhere. So the potential to do these things is there. I actually have a picture here that I took from the graphic a couple of years ago. The mayor of Accra receiving a check for $100,000 from the ambassador of Turkey to build a wall in Accra. Now, AMA, the economy of AMA, $5 billion, bigger than the economy of several African, about 11 African countries. And yet there we are, standing on wealth and begging for money because we're not using our heads. So if we use our heads, virtually anything is possible. As I said on the platform, if others have put people on the moon, what's so difficult about putting every Ghanaian child in a classroom? Easy, easy.
All right, I'm gonna take a break. It's a good moment to toast to authentic whiskey, Patrick. Yeah. So let's toast to Johnny Walker, the original taste of whiskey. Since 1820, Johnny Walker has remained the world's #1 Scotch whiskey and has won numerous awards for excellence. This because the impeccable formula of distillation has been jealously guarded over the ages, thus its distinctive taste. Johnny Walker comes from an intricate blend of a wide spectrum of carefully selected flavors, giving it that unique taste savored by millions all over the world. So let's toast to the unquestionable taste of whiskey, Johnny Walker, the whiskey the world knows best. Johnny Walker, keep walking. Drink responsibly, not for sale to persons under 18 years and pregnant women. You're watching The Lounge, and it's coming to you from the Equator Bar at La Palm Royal Beach Hotel, and it's sponsored by Johnny Walker. Keep walking. We're taking a quick break. We'll be back in a minute.